Hi all, and welcome to the next episode in our webinar series. This month's topic, we're going to be talking about online child exploitation in Canada. But first, a couple little housekeeping items. So firstly, I'd like to send out just a quick warning that some of the content you're about to hear might be quite upsetting due to the nature of the presentation. So please practice good self-care and step away from the recording or pause it if you need to do that. Also, we'd like to acknowledge, of course, that the Women's Resource Center is located on Treaty 2 territory, but we also operate on Treaty 1 territory, and these are the lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and also comprise the homeland of the Métis Nation. Also, just a quick note that if you hear noise in the background, my apologies. There's construction where I am today. It shouldn't be too bad, but if you hear any kind of noise, that's what that is. So just a quick overview of the roadmap, what we're going to be going over today. We're going to be talking about what online child exploitation is. We're going to go over some common aspects of online child exploitation, namely grooming, sextortion, NCDII, or the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, which, if you remember, was actually the subject of last month's webinar, but this time we're going to be applying it specifically to online child exploitation. We'll be talking about capping, and at the end, I'll provide some help and resources, as well as, of course, our contact information as normal. So, what is online child exploitation? Public Safety Canada and the Government of Canada define online child exploitation as follows. Online child sexual exploitation is when children are tricked into seeing or participating in online encounters of a sexual nature. So that's really pretty broad, but that's for a reason. As you're going to see, there are a lot of different ways that online child sexual exploitation can occur. Cybertip.ca is actually the main reporting agency in Canada for online child sexual exploitation. And so a lot of the information that we're going to be talking about today comes from cybertip.ca. And at the end, I'll be linking some resources on their website, as well as the website of Canadian Centre for Child Protection, which is linked to cybertip.ca. So actually, over the last few years, rates of online child sexual exploitation appear to have been increasing, and that's likely due to a number of factors, including that children are using technology earlier in life than perhaps they had been before, and also the kind of evolving tactics that offenders of child sexual exploitation use can cause rates to fluctuate. According to cybertip.ca, over the last maybe year or two, rates have actually increased 36% based on what they're seeing. But it's also important to note that not all instances of child sexual exploitation online get reported. So the actual numbers of child sexual exploitation online are likely a lot higher than what we're seeing. And so we just use them as a benchmark to kind of get a sense of where we're sitting. So Statistics Canada shows that from 2014 to 2020, there were over 10,000 police-reported incidents of online child sexual exploitation. And again, those numbers are going to be a lot higher given that not all instances of online child sexual exploitation are reported to police. So these are just the ones that we know of, but likely there are a lot more happening that are not entered into the official systems and official databases that track this kind of thing. So just a little bit of information on what the demographics look like. 73% of online child sexual exploitation victims are girls between 12 and 17 years of age. 13% are girls under 12, 11% are boys between 12 and 17, and 3% are boys under 12. So you can kind of see that it is heavily skewed towards girls being the victim of online child sexual exploitation, with a huge proportion of victims being girls at all ages, really. But also important to note that boys do experience child sexual exploitation online as well. And it does impact boys and girls differently, as we'll talk about a little bit. And a couple of tidbits of information on perpetrators. So 39% of child sexual exploitation perpetrators are strangers to their victims. 25% of them are casual acquaintances, so somebody that the child or youth knows of but wouldn't necessarily consider a friend or a family member or anything like that. 8% are a friend of the victim, 7% are a family member of the victim, and 7% are an intimate partner. And it's important to point out intimate partner violence in this case because a lot of youth, especially older youth in that like 15, 16, 17-year-old range, may be involved in dating relationships or have intimate partners. And in 7% of online child exploitation cases, the intimate partner is the one perpetrating the violence against the victim. So 91% of online child sexual exploitation perpetrators are men or boys, and typically they're a lot older than the victims that they're targeting. So we saw just a second ago that the victims are overwhelmingly girls, and also we're seeing here that the perpetrators are overwhelmingly men or boys, I guess, in the cases where it's an intimate partner of similar age to the victim. And as I said just a minute ago, not all cases of online child sexual exploitation are reported to the police. And there's a number of reasons why that is. And in many cases, children and youth are extremely reluctant to come to a trusted adult. They might fear victim blaming, the adults in their life saying things like, well, why would you, for example, take that picture and send it? Kind of making it the fault of the victim when it should really be the focus should really be on the wrongdoing of the perpetrator. Children and youth might also not want to quote unquote let down the adults in their life, so they'll keep something like this to themselves to kind of avoid feeling like they've disappointed the adults in their life. And in a lot of cases, children and youth just actually might not be totally sure what to do, what's available for help, where to go. In some cases, children and youth might not be sure of who is safe to trust with information like this. So they end up not coming forward with cases like this. And in a minute, we're going to be talking about some types of online child sexual exploitation. But I want to quickly mention something called cyber flashing. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but it is important to note that it is a form of online sexual violence, something that has become common in recent years, with girls in particular experiencing cyber flashing. And what that is essentially is just receiving unsolicited pictures of like genitals or sex acts or things like that. And the perpetrator is sending them unsolicited to victims. We're not going to be spending more time talking about it other than that, but it's important to recognize that it is an aspect of sexual violence online and something that is common and experienced by children and youth. So there are, of course, a lot of long-term impacts of online child sexual exploitation. Of course, victims may experience psychological harms. They might acquire anxiety, or they might feel depressed. They might have social harms. They could have trouble with trusting. They could have trouble making friends, especially if somebody finds out about the online child sexual exploitation that a victim has experienced. That could lead to things like bullying or social isolation, which could be very harmful. It could also cause impaired sexual development. It could increase the potential for substance use. And because of how the internet works, and because we know that it is extremely difficult to have images completely removed from the internet forever, there's always the possibility of continued victimization, which can have an impact on victims. And they may feel always kind of at the back of their head that there's this potential for re-victimization and redistribution, again, because it is so hard to have images scrubbed completely from the internet. And these things can last a very long time in different spaces, especially if images are passed around or saved or generally just not deleted when they're supposed to have been. So one aspect of online child sexual exploitation is grooming. And Public Safety Canada defines grooming as when someone builds trust with a child and sometimes the adults around them to gain access to and control the child by normalizing certain behaviors and expectations. And I want to be super clear here that we are talking about grooming in situations of online child sexual exploitation, and that we are not talking about this kind of co-opted, incorrect definition of grooming that is being circulated a lot online with reference to discrimination against 2S LGBT folks. So that conversation is not coming into this at all. We're not going to be talking about that because we're going to be talking about actual grooming. So there have been some common grooming tactics identified when we're talking about online child sexual exploitation. So, for example, the perpetrator might pretend to be someone they're not to gain the trust of a child. They might pretend to be like the child's own age or a student at their school or something like that. They may pretend to be interested in the child's hobbies or interests or friends to try and make that connection so that they can gain access further to the child. Groomers will often make unrealistic promises or promise things they can't keep. They might promise money, or they might promise friendship or things like that in order to gain access to the child, but it's just really a manipulation tactic. They might try to turn the child against their parents or caregivers by saying things like, your parents don't really care for you, we'll get out of the family situation as soon as possible. We'll run away, things like that, to try and convince the child or youth that things or life would be better with the groomer than with their family and friends. They might initiate sexual conversations by showing the child or youth sexual images or videos, or by moving the relationship into a sexual space, kind of trying to normalize the sending of sexual images and videos with children and youth. They might try to normalize having sexual conversations with children and youth in order to try and, again, gain access and control their behaviors. And then once they've kind of established that norm, then they may ask the child or youth to start sending recordings or images of a sexual nature, which then could lead to things like threatening or pressuring the child or youth to do what they're asking, again, with that aspect of control. And they could also repeatedly suggest in-person meetings, again, to try and strengthen the bond that they're trying to create with grooming. And I think the important thing to remember about grooming is that its entire purpose is about control and trying to alter the behaviors of a child to suit the purpose of what the groomer or perpetrator is trying to do. And grooming, as you may have been thinking as I was talking about that, grooming can often lead to situations of sextortion. Public Safety Canada defines sextortion as a type of blackmail where someone threatens to send a sexual image or video to friends, family, or other people if the victim, don't provide more sexual content, pay them, the perpetrator, or do what they, the perpetrator, ask. So again, cybertip.ca is the national reporting organization for online child sexual exploitation. And they estimate that they receive 70 reports of sextortion per week. And over the course of their existence, they estimate that they have received nearly 2,000 reports of sextortion. Both boys and girls experience sextortion, but like I mentioned before, aspects of online child sexual exploitation have different impacts on boys and girls. So, for example, most victims of sextortion situations that we are aware of, 91% of those victims are male. And typically, in cases of sextortion, boys are asked for money, which can really vary in amounts from very low amounts to thousands of dollars. And when girls are exposed to situations of sextortion, they're often asked for more images or recordings. The offender or perpetrator often also tries to prove, quote unquote, to the victim. They have personal information about the victim that would make it easy for the offender to find the youth if they don't comply. So they might share screen grabs of the victim's contacts. They might they might share with the victim that they know where they live or what school they go to or what kind of clubs they're involved in. If they're an older youth, they might share that they know where they work, things like that. And if the victim doesn't comply, oftentimes the offenders will just continue to try and sextort the youth. They don't necessarily lay off. And however, if the victim does comply, the sextortion likely also will continue, with the demands of the offender just increasing and becoming more severe. So that's why it's really important that we know how sextortion works, and we are talking to children and youth about online child sexual exploitation so that they know how to recognize if this is something that's happening to them so that they can come forward and it can be stopped. There are some common sextortion tactics that take place in a variety of sextortion experiences. So the offender will initially offer the victim money as a quote unquote gift to try and normalize this exchange of sexual abuse imagery for money. The perpetrator will also often go after people connected to the initial victim, so like siblings or friends or cousins or things like that, to try and coerce the victim into complying with their demands. The perpetrator rather might use multiple accounts or usernames to try and trick the victim into believing that it's multiple people sextorting at once, when really it's just like one person who's got multiple accounts going that they're working off of. And they might also coerce the victim themselves to make multiple accounts or usernames under their own name and then provide the username and password to the perpetrator. And then the perpetrator will use those accounts under the victim's name to sextort and harass and exploit other children and youth. And again, just as we saw that grooming is linked to sextortion, sextortion is also closely linked with other types of online sexual exploitation, including, we've already talked about grooming, but luring as well. And it's also linked to, again, the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. So as we're going through this, I'm sure you're noticing that all of these things are very closely linked together and kind of can happen at the same time. So where there's one type of victimization, for example, grooming, there's often a secondary type of victimization that can happen as well. So somebody who's experiencing grooming might also experience non-consensual distribution of intimate images. They might also experience sextortion. They might also experience luring, things like that. Non-consensual distribution of intimate images is something that we actually talked about in greater detail in our previous webinar. So if you want to watch that, just go back in our videos and feel free to give that one a watch. Or if you've watched it already, this will just be a little refresher for you. So the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, or NCDII for short, is when images of a sexual nature are shared without the consent of the person in the images. It's a crime in the Criminal Code of Canada. It was added in March of 2015 when Bill C-13 passed, came into effect. On the provincial level, we also have a law regarding NCDII called the Intimate Images Protection Act. And the Intimate Images Protection Act outlines supports for people who have been victimized by NCDII and mandates that those supports be available. And it also defines the tort of NCDII in Manitoba, so that allows people to go to civil court and sue perpetrators of NCDII, in addition to having it be a crime available for prosecution in the criminal court. That one was passed in Manitoba in 2014-15, so right around the same time as the federal law came into effect. NCDII, again, as we talked about in the previous webinar, has largely been a focus of cyberbullying and privacy concerns. But it's also an issue of gender equality, as we talked about. It affects women and girls a lot more frequently than it affects boys and men. And as we saw previously in this presentation, online child sexual exploitation affects boys and girls differently, and NCDII is no exception. And again, it tends to affect girls more often than it affects boys, although it does affect boys as well. And again, with the intersection of crimes, NCDII often intersects with crimes like child sexual exploitation, child sexual abuse, hate speech, voyeurism, gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, and stalking. And even though it does intersect with these other crimes, it's important to recognize it as a crime of its own accord because it does perpetrate a specific set of harms. And especially when we're talking about children and youth, it was found that between the ages of 18 and of people between the ages of 18 and 26, so that kind of older youth category, it's been found that about half have engaged in quote unquote sexting, which can turn into NCDII when those images are circulated without the consent of the person in those images. So it can easily and unfortunately often does translate from sexting into NCDII. And so we want to be, again, making children and youth aware of this so they can recognize it if it's happening to them, and so that they know that there are trusted adults that they can approach so that it can be stopped. And finally, we're going to be talking about capping, which is relatively unknown compared to the other types of online child sexual exploitation, and it also relates to child sexual abuse imagery. And Public Safety Canada defines capping as when someone, typically an adult, records or screenshots youth they target on various video streaming platforms or applications, getting naked or engaging in sexual activities, often without the victim knowing that they're recording. And again, there are common tactics that happen in capping situations. So again, just like with grooming, the perpetrator rather will pretend to be a child or youth when they're not, again, to try and gain the trust and build a rapport with the victim. The perpetrator then, once they've kind of built a little bit of a rapport, will ask the victim to go into like a private chat or a less secure chat space for a video chat. They might use bait videos, which are typically edited videos of the perpetrator engaging in sexual activities that they use to kind of start the sexual conversation with the youth. So they'll send one and then they'll coerce in an effort to coerce the victim into sending one back. So using it kind of as bait, saying that, the perpetrator making it like they're okay with it, using these fake videos to try and gain the trust of the victim. And they'll also use coercion or trickery to convince the child or youth to engage in sexual activity, either through those bait videos or through pretending to be a child or youth or through other avenues of coercion. And often instances of capping, so from the beginning of pretending to be a child or youth to asking to go into that private chat space for a video chat to using the bait videos, this can take place over the course of like 20 minutes. So it's not like this is happening over the course of weeks or months, although that does happen. A lot of times this happens very quickly. And cappers are very fast and efficient at what they do. So once they get the victim into that private or less secure chat space for video chat, they'll often capture the images or videos that the child or youth sends them so quickly that they don't even know that it's happened. And by the time they do know that it's happened, they are unable to do anything about it because the perpetrator will then disappear. So again, these are things that happen very quickly, and there's heavy use of coercion and trickery used in these like online chat spaces that put victims at risk for things like capping. However, there are some help and resources. So one thing is going through cybertip.ca's website to look at all of these fact sheets on extortion, lowering online sexual violence, child sexual exploitation. Cybertip.ca also has parenting resources available. So if anybody watching this is a parent and you're not sure how to talk to your child about the potential for online sexual violence, they have resources for that that can help you kind of wade through that conversation, because again, it is incredibly important that children and youth have this discussed with them so that they know what these types of violence and exploitation look like, so they can recognize if it happens to them, so that they can feel safe asking somebody for help. There are also some articles on the Justice Canada website, and this one in the BC Law Review here at the bottom is a really great article on the non-consensual distribution of intimate images in Canada, if you're looking for more in-depth information on that one. It was also included in our previous webinar on NCDII, so if you want more information about that without having to go read the whole article, you can just head back to that webinar and watch it. There's also Manitoba Victim Services that families can contact if a child has been the victim of online child sexual exploitation, and they can kind of direct you from there. The province of Manitoba on their website here has a NCDII fact sheet. Cybertip has an info packet on Manitoba's Intimate Image Protection Act if you're wanting more information on that. Cybertip.ca's website itself also has a report form for people under 18, so that if children or youth have experienced online child sexual exploitation, this is where you go to report it online. And cybertip.ca will follow up with that. The Intimate Images Protection Act in Manitoba actually designated the Canadian Centre for Child Protection, which runs Cybertip, as the agency to receive reports of NCDII and child sexual abuse imagery in Manitoba, and you can head to their website for more information on that. I would suggest looking at the information they have regarding their project Arachnid, which is something they use to comb the internet for child sexual abuse imagery, find it, and remove it from the internet. It's extremely interesting and it's doing a lot of great work. So poke around the Cybertip website, the Canadian Centre for Child Protection website, and just kind of go through their research and their resources. There might be something helpful for you there as well. And as always, we have our contact information here for you if you'd like to give us a call or an email with any questions or concerns. We'd be more than happy to do what we can to help you out. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back next month with another webinar.